America loves the new year. Midnight countdowns, fireworks in the cold sky, champagne corks popping, promises whispered like prayers. A clean page, a fresh start. That's the story you were taught. But for millions of Black Americans in the early 1900s, January 1st wasn't a beginning. It was a reminder. A reminder of where they stood and where they were not allowed to go. While white America welcomed the new year with celebration, Black America braced itself, not for joy, for survival. Picture the United States at the turn of the 20th century. Jim Crow was law. Segregation wasn't a suggestion, it was enforced. Violence wasn't rare, it was routine. Freedom existed on paper, but power lived elsewhere. And holidays? Holidays were not neutral. They reflected who mattered. For white families, New Year's Day meant rest. Shops closed, factories slowed, church bells rang in celebration. For Black families, January 1st often meant the opposite. More labor, more scrutiny, more fear. Domestic workers were expected to show up early, sometimes earlier than usual, to clean up after white celebrations that lasted all night. Farm laborers were back in the fields at dawn, cold cutting through thin coats, hands already cracked from winter work. Railroad porters, cooks, laundresses, and servants didn't get to mark time. Time marked them. There was a cruel irony in it. The same country celebrating a new beginning was denying Black Americans even the illusion of one. Because the calendar didn't change power. In many Southern towns, Black people weren't allowed to gather publicly without permission. No parades, no public festivities, no loud celebration. Joy itself could be read as defiance. A group of Black men laughing together on New Year's Day could be questioned, stopped, beaten. A Black family walking at night could be accused of causing trouble simply by existing. So people learned restraint. They learned quiet. They learned how to survive celebrations meant for someone else. And yet, something else happened beneath the surface, something history rarely shows. Black communities didn't stop marking time. They just did it differently. Inside small wooden churches, elders gathered quietly. No fireworks, no music spilling into the streets, just prayer. Hands held tightly, heads bowed low, not asking for wealth, not asking for comfort, asking for safety, asking to see another year, asking that their children might live longer than they did. In homes lit by oil lamps, mothers whispered promises to their children. This year will be better. Stay close. Be careful. New Year's resolutions weren't about self-improvement. They were about survival. Avoid this street. Don't answer back. Come home before dark. And there was one day in particular that haunted Black families long before New Year's ever arrived. January 1st had another name, Emancipation Day. The day slavery officially ended, or at least the day it was supposed to. Because for many Black Americans, emancipation didn't feel like freedom, it felt like replacement. Chains removed, but replaced with sharecropping, with debt peonage, with laws designed to pull them right back into dependency. In some places, January 1st became a day of dread. Land contracts reset, debts were recalculated, families could be evicted with little notice. A new year often meant starting again with less than before. Imagine that, a holiday meant to symbolize hope becoming a symbol of loss. That contradiction sat heavy in Black memory, generation after generation. This is why silence mattered. This is why celebration looked different. Black Americans learned early that visibility could be dangerous, joy could be punished, hope could be mocked,
confidence could invite violence. So people learned to carry strength inward. And yet, even in that silence, resistance lived. Not loud, not cinematic, but real. A father teaching his son to read by candlelight, knowing education was a threat to the system. A mother saving pennies all year, quietly planning a future she was told would never exist. A church elder reminding the community, they survived worse than this. This wasn't passivity, it was endurance. And endurance is not weakness, it is strategy. White America rang in the new year believing history moved forward naturally. Black America knew better. History had to be carried. And that's what they did. Through labor that built the country but earned no credit. Through laws designed to break them but failed. Through holidays they weren't invited to celebrate. They carried time forward. Quietly, deliberately, together. So when you see old photographs of early 1900s New Year's celebrations, white faces smiling, glasses raised, fireworks overhead, understand what's missing. The people who made those celebrations possible, the cooks, the cleaners, the laborers, the families waiting for dawn to break without incident. This story isn't about bitterness, it's about truth. Because you can't understand America's holidays without understanding who was excluded from them. And you can't understand Black resilience without understanding how often joy had to be postponed. The New Year wasn't denied to Black Americans because they lacked hope. It was denied because hope threatened the system. And still, they carried it anyway. Into churches, into homes, into generations. This is where the story begins. Not with fireworks, not with countdowns, but with quiet endurance. And in the next part, we'll look at how Black Americans reclaimed time itself, turning stolen days into survival, memory, and resistance.
By the early 1900s, Black Americans understood something most white Americans never had to think about. Time itself could be weaponized. The calendar wasn't neutral, holidays weren't harmless, and January 1st, the symbol of renewal, often arrived carrying consequences. Because for Black families, the new year didn't reset opportunity, it reset control. In the South, January 1st marked more than a date, it marked contracts. Sharecropping agreements were renegotiated or terminated at the start of the year. Families who had worked land for 12 months could wake up on January 1st with nothing. No crops, no shelter, no leverage, just debt. Debt that ensured they'd be forced right back into the same system. This was not accidental. It was designed. By tying survival to the calendar, white landowners controlled movement, labor, and hope. A Black family that celebrated too openly, spoke too boldly, or questioned unfair terms risked eviction. And eviction didn't mean inconvenience, it meant exposure to hunger, to violence, to forced migration. So when white America toasted the new year, Black America counted risks. Would the contract hold? Would the overseer demand more hours? Would wages be cut? Would violence follow? And then there were the laws. Jim Crow statutes didn't pause for holidays. They intensified enforcement because holidays meant visibility, and visibility made white authorities nervous. In many towns, police patrols increased on New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, not to protect Black communities, but to monitor them. A Black man walking after dark could be arrested for loitering. A Black woman visiting family without written permission could be accused of vagrancy. A Black gathering could be dispersed under the excuse of keeping order. Order, of course, meant hierarchy. And yet, Black people still found ways to mark time. They just did it beneath the surface. One of the most powerful traditions was prayer watch night. On December 31st, Black churches gathered quietly, sometimes all night, not to celebrate, but to prepare.
Prepare for the unknown year ahead. Prepare for loss. Prepare for endurance. Watch night services didn't begin in America. They came from African spiritual traditions and were reinforced during slavery. Enslaved people gathered on December 31st, 1862, waiting for midnight, waiting for the Emancipation Proclamation to take effect. That night was filled with hope. But the years that followed taught a painful lesson. Freedom didn't arrive the same way for everyone. By the early 1900s, Watch Night became less about celebration and more about survival. Prayers weren't about prosperity, they were about protection. Let my children live another year. Let my husband come home safely. Let this year not take more than the last. In white newspapers of the time, New Year's Day was described as festive. In Black memory, it was cautious, measured. Children felt it too. Black children learned early that holidays weren't equal. They watched white children receive gifts, attend parties, stay home from school. Meanwhile, they accompanied parents to work or stayed indoors, told not to draw attention. Joy was something to ration. And then there was violence, because nothing enforced silence like fear. Between 1990 and 2020, lynchings increased around holidays, not because holidays caused violence, but because gatherings created excuses for white mobs to accuse Black men of being out of place, excuses to reassert dominance. A new year didn't mean safety. Sometimes it meant danger. This is why Black Americans developed a different relationship with time. They didn't trust fresh starts, they trusted preparation. Instead of resolutions, they made contingencies. If this fails, we move here. If work disappears, we adjust. If violence comes, we hide. This wasn't pessimism, it was intelligence. And yet, despite all of this, something remarkable happened. Black Americans refused to let the calendar erase them. They claimed memory. January 1st became a day of remembrance, not just of emancipation, but of struggle. Elders told stories, not sanitized versions, truth, about slavery that never fully ended, about freedom that came with conditions, about survival that required strategy. These stories weren't written down, they were passed orally, because writing them down could be dangerous, because memory itself was resistance. White America wanted Black history to begin with servitude and end with silence. Black communities refused. They remembered African ancestry. They remembered resistance. They remembered that their lives existed before bondage and would exist after oppression. That's why New Year's mattered differently. It wasn't about pretending everything was new. It was about acknowledging what hadn't changed and surviving anyway. If you're wondering why this history isn't taught, the answer is simple. It complicates the story. It challenges the idea that progress was automatic, that freedom arrived cleanly, that America moved forward together. But history doesn't move evenly. Some people are dragged, others are carried. And Black Americans learned to carry each other when the calendar offered no mercy. By the early 20th century, New Year's Day stood as a quiet contradiction, a holiday celebrating possibility, built on exclusion, a nation claiming renewal while denying rest to millions. And still, Black Americans endured, not because they were invited to hope, but because they refused to abandon it. In the next part, we'll explore something even more unsettling: how Black Americans didn't just survive these stolen holidays, they transformed them, turning denial into culture, silence into strength, and legacy.
By the 1910s and 1920s, something began to shift. Not in laws, not in power, but in how Black Americans understood time itself. Because when a system keeps denying you rest, joy, and renewal, you eventually learn a dangerous truth. You don't wait for permission to mark your life. You take it. Black Americans began reclaiming time in ways white America didn't always see. Not through fireworks, not through parades, but through culture, through ritual, through memory. One of the most powerful transformations happened quietly. January 1st stopped being only a reminder of loss. It became a marker of continuity. In Black churches, Watch Night evolved. It was no longer only about survival. It became about testimony. People stood and spoke aloud what they had lived through the past year, who they lost, what they endured, what they learned. This wasn't therapy, it was collective truth-telling. Speaking your survival out loud in a country that wanted you silent was an act of defiance. Music followed. Spirituals blended into blues, blues into gospel. Songs weren't written to entertain white audiences. They were written to carry pain without breaking. Lyrics spoke of crossing rivers, of waiting mornings, of holding on just a little longer. New Year's songs weren't about celebration. They were about persistence. Outside the South, something else was happening. Migration. As the Great Migration accelerated, millions of Black Americans left the South. They didn't just move geography, they moved memory. They carried Southern experiences of stolen holidays into Northern cities, Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, and when they arrived, they encountered something new. Opportunity mixed with hostility. Factories offered wages, but discrimination followed. Housing existed, but redlining confined it. Freedom expanded, but unevenly. Still, the new year felt different in these cities. Not equal, but less controlled. Black communities began organizing their own New Year traditions. Church gatherings grew larger. Social clubs formed. Mutual aid societies held meetings at the start of the year, not to celebrate, but to plan. Who needed help? Who was unemployed? Whose rent was due? This was not charity. It was infrastructure. White America measured progress in individual success. Black America measured it in collective survival. And this terrified the system, because communities that support themselves don't collapse easily. By the 1920s, Harlem emerged as something unprecedented, a place where Black creativity was visible, loud, unapologetic. The Harlem Renaissance didn't just change art, it changed time. Black writers, musicians, and thinkers reframed history. They refused to let Black life be defined only by suffering. They wrote about joy, complexity, intellect, and desire. They placed Black existence firmly in the present and the future. New Year's in Harlem didn't look like New Year's in the Jim Crow South. There were parties, there was music, there was laughter. But even here, the past wasn't forgotten. Every celebration carried memory of what had been denied, of what had been stolen, of what was still not guaranteed. This dual awareness, joy layered over vigilance, became a defining feature of Black American culture. Celebration without illusion. Hope without naivete. And it wasn't just in cities. In rural communities, traditions hardened into rituals. Elders taught younger generations how to read contracts, how to save small amounts of money, how to avoid traps designed to keep them dependent. Time became a teacher. White America often framed Black resilience as passive, as endurance without agency. That framing was a lie. Resilience required strategy, it required adaptation, it required learning the rules well enough to survive them and sometimes bend them. By the mid-20th century, something undeniable had formed. A Black temporal consciousness, an understanding that time did not move forward equally for everyone, that progress could stall, reverse, fracture. This awareness fueled the civil rights movement, because activists didn't just demand rights, they demanded time. Time stolen through unpaid labor, time lost to violence, time erased by exclusion. Marches often took place on symbolic dates, anniversaries, holidays, days meant to reclaim meaning.
New Year's Day, once a reminder of powerlessness, slowly became something else. A checkpoint, a moment to assess progress. Not optimism, clarity. And clarity is dangerous, because clarity leads to action. By the mid-20th century, Black Americans no longer accepted the idea that holidays were neutral. They understood symbolism. They understood narrative. They understood that if America could celebrate freedom while denying it, then freedom had to be redefined publicly. This is why civil rights victories weren't just legal, they were cultural. They altered how time was experienced, how the future was imagined. But here's the truth rarely acknowledged. This transformation did not erase trauma. It layered over it. Even today, echoes remain. Black Americans still enter New Year's differently. Still cautious, still strategic, still aware that progress can be reversed, that rights can be rolled back, that safety is conditional. And yet, joy persists. Not because history improved smoothly, but because people refuse to let it define them completely. The new year was never given to Black Americans. It was taken. Slowly, quietly, collectively. And in the next part, we'll confront the uncomfortable question that remains. What does it mean to celebrate today, knowing how many were denied the right to do so? And how does memory shape responsibility?
By the time we reach the present, the fireworks are louder than ever. Cities light up. Crowds count down together. Screens blow with celebrations from around the world. The new year is marketed as universal, a moment everyone shares. But history doesn't disappear just because the calendar turns. For Black Americans, the question is not whether to celebrate, it's how, and with what awareness. Because the past isn't distant, it's inherited. Generational memory doesn't live in textbooks, it lives in behavior, in caution passed down quietly, in parents reminding children to be careful even during celebrations, in the instinct to prepare for loss even when things seem stable. This is why, even today, many Black families approach the new year with restraint, not pessimism, realism. The past taught them that optimism without preparation can be dangerous, that systems don't change overnight, that progress can be undone. This isn't paranoia, it's historical literacy. Think about how America frames the new year. New beginnings, fresh starts, anything is possible. Those phrases assume access, they assume safety, they assume the freedom to fail without consequence. But for much of American history, Black Americans didn't have that luxury. Mistakes were punished harder. Visibility carried risk. Failure wasn't temporary, it was permanent. So New Year's resolutions were different. They weren't about reinvention, they were about preservation. And that mindset didn't vanish with legal victories, it adapted. Even after segregation laws fell, inequality didn't disappear, it changed form. Redlining replaced overt exclusion. Mass incarceration replaced chain gangs. Economic inequality replaced legal bondage. So when Black Americans today step into a new year, they carry layered awareness of what has changed and what hasn't. This is why conversations about moving on often ring hollow. You can't move on from something that still shapes outcomes. You can't celebrate closure where none was given. And yet, Black Americans are often asked to perform joy, to demonstrate progress, to reassure the nation that everything is fine. Holidays become stages. Black joy becomes evidence. But joy does not erase history. It exists alongside it. The danger comes when celebration is used to silence memory, when the narrative becomes, "Look how far we've come," without acknowledging who paid the price. Because the truth is uncomfortable. America's holidays were built on unequal access. Freedom was staggered.
Joy was rationed. Time itself was divided. And the effects are cumulative. Generations denied rest carry exhaustion forward. Generations denied celebration learn restraint. Generations denied safety develop vigilance. This doesn't make Black Americans broken, it makes them aware. Awareness is often misread as bitterness, but bitterness fixates on the past. Awareness learns from it. That's why this history matters. Not to shame celebration, but to deepen it. To understand that when Black Americans celebrate the new year today, they're not just marking 12 months, they're honoring survival across centuries. Every laugh carries memory. Every gathering carries context. Every moment of joy exists because someone before them endured without it. And this awareness creates responsibility. Responsibility to remember. Responsibility to question narratives that erase struggle. Responsibility to recognize that equality and celebration is recent and fragile. This is not about guilt, it's about honesty. When we tell a simplified story of American holidays, we flatten experience. We erase the unevenness of progress. We pretend time moved equally for everyone. It didn't. And acknowledging that doesn't weaken the nation, it strengthens it. Because a country mature enough to face its past is better equipped to build a fair future. The new year invites reflection, not just personal goals, but collective truth. Who was excluded? Who was denied rest? Who carried the burden while others celebrated? And more importantly, who still does? These questions don't ruin the holiday, they ground it. They remind us that celebration without memory is shallow, that renewal without justice is incomplete. Black Americans have always known this. That's why their celebrations carry depth, why joy is intentional, why hope is earned. The new year was never simply a date, it was a mirror, reflecting who belonged and who was made to wait. In the final part, we'll return to the present moment and ask the question that remains unanswered. What does it mean to step into a new year knowing what it cost others to get here? And what does that knowledge demand of us now?
So here we are, another year ending, another one beginning. The countdown starts again. 10, 9, 8. The moment feels familiar. But history reminds us, familiar doesn't always mean equal. For Black Americans, stepping into a new year has never been just about the future. It's always carried the weight of the past. Not as nostalgia, as knowledge. Knowledge of what it meant to live in a country where time itself was uneven, where some people were allowed to rest, dream, and reset, while others were expected to endure without pause. That history didn't disappear. It didn't end with emancipation. It didn't end with civil rights laws. It didn't end with progress narratives. It adapted. The language changed. The system shifted. But the question remained, who gets to feel safe stepping into tomorrow? Even now, that question isn't abstract. It shows up in statistics, in health disparities, in wealth gaps, in life expectancy, in how long people live, and how much of that life is spent under stress. Stress isn't just emotional, it's historical, it's inherited. Researchers call it weathering, the idea that generations of pressure, exclusion, and vigilance take a physical toll. Bodies carry memory even when minds are told to move on. This is why New Year's feels complicated, because renewal assumes rest, and rest has never been equally distributed. Think about how often Black Americans are told to celebrate progress, to focus on success stories, to emphasize positivity. Those stories matter, but they don't cancel the cost. You can honor resilience without pretending the burden was fair. You can celebrate joy without erasing what it took to reach it. The danger comes when celebration replaces accountability, when the story becomes, "Look how far we've come," instead of,
look what people survived and why. Because survival is not the same as justice. Black Americans didn't survive the denial of holidays because the system was kind. They survived because community was strong, because culture carried what institutions refused to provide, because people learned how to protect each other when the calendar offered no mercy. That legacy still exists. You see it in how Black families gather, in how elders speak before midnight, in how prayers are whispered quietly even during celebration. You see it in the instinct to check on loved ones, to make sure everyone made it home, to treat joy as something precious, not guaranteed. That instinct isn't fear, it's wisdom. The new year has always been a test of whether hope can exist without illusion, whether joy can coexist with truth, whether progress can be acknowledged without forgetting its cost. Black Americans have been passing that test for centuries. So what does this history ask of us now? Not guilt, not silence, but awareness. Awareness that holidays carry power, that narratives shape memory, that what we celebrate and how we celebrate reveals who we see. It asks us to remember that for much of American history, Black Americans weren't invited to mark time with joy. They were forced to carry it forward quietly. And it asks us something else, something harder. What does it mean to celebrate freedom when others were denied the right to rest? What does it mean to claim renewal when some communities are still recovering? What does it mean to count down to midnight without counting who paid the price for this moment? These questions don't ruin celebration, they deepen it. Because celebration without memory is fragile, it cracks under pressure. But celebration grounded in truth endures. Black Americans didn't just survive stolen New Year's, they redefined them. They turned denied rest into resilience, denied celebration into culture, denied hope into strategy. And that transformation didn't benefit only Black communities, it reshaped America itself. Much of what we now call American culture, music, language, ritual, creativity, was born from people forced to find meaning where none was offered. That is not tragedy, that is contribution. But contribution deserves recognition, not erasure. So when the countdown reaches 0 tonight, when the noise peaks, when the lights flash, when voices rise together, remember this. Not everyone arrived here the same way. Some were carried, some were dragged, some had to fight for the right to stand still. And still, they came. The new year wasn't given to Black Americans, it was claimed, year after year, generation after generation. Not with fireworks, but with endurance. Not with permission, but with purpose. And that legacy doesn't ask to be pitied, it asks to be honored. Because the future doesn't begin equally for everyone. But understanding history gives us a choice. To celebrate without forgetting. To hope without denial. To move forward without pretending the past didn't happen. The calendar will turn whether we're ready or not. The question is, what will we carry with us when it does?
There's a moment every year that feels universal, the final seconds before midnight. People stop talking, music fades, everyone waits. It's supposed to feel equal, but equality has never been about moments. It's about access. For Black Americans, the new year has never been a blank page. It has always been written over, with memory, with caution, with inherited awareness. That awareness didn't come from pessimism, it came from experience, because history taught a brutal lesson. The future doesn't arrive fairly just because the clock says it should. For generations, Black Americans were told to be patient, to wait, to believe the next year would be different. But year after year, the pattern repeated. New promises, same systems. So people stopped believing in sudden change.
They believed in preparation. Preparation became tradition. Tradition became culture. Culture became survival. This is why Black Americans often approach time differently, why progress is measured carefully, why optimism is guarded, why celebration is intentional. It's not because hope is absent, it's because hope learned discipline. When you've lived through stolen labor, denied rest, and erased joy, you don't assume the future owes you anything. You make plans anyway. That mindset shaped everything: family structures, faith traditions, music, language, even humor. Especially humor, because laughter became a way to breathe under pressure. And that pressure never fully lifted. Even today, stepping into a new year carries calculation. Can we afford this? Is this safe? What happens if things change? These aren't signs of weakness, they're signs of historical intelligence. America often celebrates bold optimism, big risks, big dreams, but it rarely acknowledges the people who had to survive without safety nets, without forgiveness for mistakes, without the freedom to fail quietly. Black Americans learned to navigate a world where mistakes were punished harder, where rest was earned only through exhaustion, where celebration could be misunderstood as defiance. So time itself became political. That's why this history matters now, not as a lesson about the past, but as a lens for the present. Because when we talk about inequality today, we often ignore time. We ignore how long people have been denied rest, how long they've lived under pressure, how long progress has been delayed, reversed, or rationed. Time accumulates. So does stress. So does trauma. And yet, so does wisdom. Black Americans didn't just survive unequal time. They mastered it. They learned how to stretch moments, how to create meaning in small spaces, how to build futures without guarantees. That's not accidental. That's skill. But skill developed under pressure deserves recognition, not romanticization. Too often, resilience is praised without acknowledging what caused it, as if strength appeared naturally, as if endurance was a choice. It wasn't. It was required. So when we reflect on the new year now, the question isn't, should we celebrate? It's, what are we celebrating for? Are we celebrating the illusion that everything resets equally? Or are we honoring the people who carried time forward when the system refused to? Because the truth is, the new year doesn't erase history. It reveals it. It shows who gets to rest, who gets to hope freely, who still has to calculate survival. That doesn't mean joy is wrong. It means joy should be informed. A celebration grounded in truth is stronger than one built on forgetting. Black Americans have always known this. That's why joy looks layered, why laughter can exist alongside grief, why celebration can feel quiet. It's not less meaningful. It's more. As the calendar turns again, we inherit a choice, not just individually, collectively. We can continue telling a simplified story, one where progress happened naturally, where freedom arrived cleanly, where time treated everyone the same. Or we can tell the honest one, the one where Black Americans were denied rest, celebration, and safety, and still built culture, community, and continuity. The honest story doesn't ask for pity, it asks for responsibility. Responsibility to remember, responsibility to question, responsibility to ensure that renewal is not symbolic, but structural. Because the future doesn't become fair by accident. It becomes fair through acknowledgement, through repair, through intention. The new year has always asked the same question, not what will change, but who will change it. Black Americans have answered that question for centuries, often without credit, often without rest, often without celebration. And still, they carried time forward. So when the next countdown begins, when voices rise, when glasses lift, when promises are made, remember this: the new year wasn't always for everyone, and the work of making it so isn't finished. Because time alone doesn't heal. People do.
There's a quiet truth about history that often goes unsaid. The past doesn't stay behind us. It rearranges itself inside the present. That's why certain dates feel heavier than others. Why some holidays carry tension instead of ease. Why joy can arrive with conditions attached. For Black Americans, the New Year has always been one of those dates. Not because celebration is unwanted, but because memory insists on being present. Memory of denied rest. Memory of labor without pause. Memory of being watched while others celebrated freely. Those memories didn't vanish with time. They learned to coexist with progress. Today, the new year looks different. Legal barriers are gone. Public celebrations are shared. Representation exists where silence once ruled. And yet, patterns remain. Many Black Americans still enter the year calculating budgets, safety, healthcare, housing. The questions have changed, but the vigilance hasn't. That vigilance isn't inherited fear, it's inherited knowledge, because history taught a lesson that still holds. Systems don't change just because the calendar does. This is why the language of fresh starts often feels incomplete. Fresh starts assume equal footing, but footing has never been equal. Some communities begin the year rested, others begin it already tired. That imbalance doesn't come from individual choices, it comes from accumulated history. Think about how often Black Americans are told to move on, to stop bringing up the past, to focus on the future. But the past isn't a story they revisit, it's a condition they navigate. You can't move on from something that still shapes outcomes. You can't forget what still informs behavior. This is why Black joy is intentional, why it's protected, why it's sometimes quiet. Joy wasn't always safe. Celebration wasn't always allowed. Visibility wasn't always survivable. So joy learned discipline, and discipline is often misunderstood. It gets labeled as pessimism, as mistrust, as negativity, but it's none of those things. It's realism shaped by experience. The new year exposes that difference clearly. When the nation celebrates possibility, some communities assess risk. When others imagine abundance, some imagine sustainability. When optimism is loud, caution is quiet, but no less necessary. None of this diminishes celebration, it contextualizes it, because true celebration doesn't require forgetting, it requires honesty. Honesty about who carried the cost. Honesty about whose labor built the comfort we enjoy. Honesty about whose rest was postponed so others could relax. That honesty doesn't weaken unity, it deepens it. A future built on selective memory is fragile. A future built on truth can endure. Black Americans have always understood this. That's why they didn't wait for permission to shape time. They created rituals, they built culture, they passed down wisdom. They learned how to survive years that offered nothing new, how to find meaning when the system offered none. That skill didn't disappear, it evolved. You see it today in how communities organize, how they prepare for uncertainty, how they build support networks before a crisis hits. That's not accidental, that's legacy. The new year invites reflection, not just personal goals, but collective awareness. It asks us to consider who is allowed to feel safe hoping, who still has to prepare for disappointment, who benefits from the idea that time heals everything. Time doesn't heal, people do, and people heal through recognition, through repair, through the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The new year can be more than a countdown. It can be a checkpoint, a moment to ask whether progress is symbolic or structural, whether celebration includes everyone, whether renewal reaches beyond slogans. Black Americans didn't survive unequal time by accident. They did it through strategy, culture, and community. That survival deserves more than admiration. It deserves action. Action that ensures rest is not a privilege, that joy is not conditional, that safety is not selective,
because the work isn't finished when the clock strikes midnight. It begins again the next morning. Every year offers the same test, not of optimism, but of responsibility. What will we remember? What will we repair? What will we refuse to ignore? The new year doesn't promise change. People do. And change doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives unevenly. It arrives slowly. It arrives because someone insisted on carrying memory forward. Black Americans have been doing that work for centuries, often without acknowledgement, often without rest, often without celebration, and still they carried time forward. So as this story ends, it doesn't ask you to feel guilty. It asks you to be aware. Aware that history lives inside the present. Aware that celebration has a cost. Aware that renewal requires intention. The new year wasn't always for everyone, and making it so remains unfinished work. That work doesn't belong to one community alone. It belongs to all of us, because a future that honors memory is stronger than one that denies it, and a celebration grounded in truth is worth carrying forward.
There is a reason some histories feel uncomfortable. It's not because they are unclear. It's because they are precise. They point directly at responsibility. Silence has always been one of the most effective tools of erasure. Not loud denial, not open hostility. Silence. For generations, the story of American holidays was told without Black presence, without Black labor, without Black endurance, without Black restraint. The new year was framed as a shared national experience, a collective reset. But collective only works when everyone is included. When Black Americans were excluded from celebration, that exclusion wasn't framed as cruelty. It was framed as normal. Normal is the most dangerous word in history. Because what is normal is rarely questioned. It became normal that Black domestic workers cleaned up after white New Year's parties. Normal that Black laborers worked while others rested. Normal that joy was conditional. And when something is normal long enough, people stop seeing it as violence. This is how erasure works, not by destroying memory outright, but by never recording it in the first place. Think about how many stories were never written, because writing was dangerous, because literacy was punished, because testimony could lead to retaliation. Entire generations lived through stolen time without leaving written records. Their history survived through behavior, through caution, through silence that carried meaning. That silence was not emptiness. It was compression. Compressed history doesn't disappear. It leaks. It shows up in health outcomes, in economic patterns, in how communities prepare for crisis before it arrives. The new year, year after year, reinforced this compression. A moment when the nation celebrated renewal, while Black Americans absorbed the reminder that renewal was uneven. This imbalance shaped identity. It taught people not to expect fairness from time, not to assume progress would arrive naturally, not to believe the calendar owed them anything. That lesson wasn't cynical, it was accurate. White America often equates hope with optimism. Black America learned to separate the two. Optimism assumes conditions will improve. Hope prepares for the possibility they won't and persists anyway. That distinction matters because optimism can collapse when systems fail. Hope endures because it was never dependent on the system. This is why Black Americans were able to endure decades where nothing seemed to change. Why joy survived without guarantees. Why culture flourished under constraint. Constraint didn't erase creativity, it sharpened it. But sharpening comes at a cost. The cost was exhaustion, generational exhaustion, the kind that doesn't disappear when laws change. This is why conversations about rest resonate so deeply today. Why wellness, boundaries, and healing are framed as necessities, not luxuries. Because rest was historically denied, not accidentally.
systematically. You cannot deny rest for centuries and expect the effects to vanish. The new year highlights that truth. It asks people to pause, to reflect, to imagine possibility. But reflection without context becomes denial. Celebration without acknowledgement becomes performance. And performance has always been demanded of Black Americans. Smile. Be grateful. Show progress. But gratitude without justice is coercion. This is why remembering matters. Not to reopen wounds, but to stop pretending they never existed. The story of New Year's exclusion is not about shame, it's about clarity. Clarity about how power operates quietly. Clarity about how inequality hides inside traditions. Clarity about how time itself can be uneven. That clarity gives us a choice. We can continue telling simplified stories, stories where progress is inevitable, where inclusion happened naturally, where the past resolved itself. Or we can tell the honest one, the one where people were denied rest, celebration, and safety, and still built the culture that defines the nation. That honest story doesn't weaken patriotism, it matures it. A nation that can face its uneven past is better equipped to create an equitable future. The new year can become something more than a ritual. It can become a reckoning. A moment to ask, who has carried time forward without rest? Who has waited longest for renewal? Who still does? Those questions don't demand immediate answers. They demand attention. Attention is the first step toward repair. Repair doesn't mean erasing celebration. It means expanding it, so that rest is not a privilege, so that joy is not conditional, so that hope is not disciplined by fear. Black Americans didn't survive unequal time by accident. They survived because they understood reality clearly, and clarity is power. The new year will come again. It always does. The question is not whether time will move forward. It always will. The question is whether we will move forward with history, or continue pretending it never happened. Because silence is a choice, and remembering is one too.
There's a myth we're taught to believe, that history moves forward in clean lines, that injustice belongs to the past, that once something is ended, its consequences disappear. But history doesn't work that way. It doesn't leave quietly. It stays. It stays in habits, in instincts, in the questions people ask or don't ask about their own lives. For Black Americans, time was never neutral. It was regulated, measured by labor instead of leisure, by survival instead of celebration. So when the new year arrived, it didn't always feel like a beginning. It felt like a continuation. Another year of waiting, another year of endurance, another year of navigating a system that didn't reset equally. That experience shaped more than behavior. It shaped worldview. It taught people not to confuse change with justice, not to mistake announcements for outcomes, not to believe that symbols replace structure. Those lessons didn't make Black Americans pessimistic. They made them precise. Precision is often mistaken for bitterness, but it's actually awareness. Awareness that systems adapt faster than they reform. Awareness that progress can coexist with inequality. Awareness that celebration can mask unfinished business. This is why the new year has always carried tension, not because hope is absent, but because hope has conditions. Hope learned restraint. Hope learned strategy. Hope learned patience that wasn't chosen, but required. That kind of hope doesn't look like fireworks. It looks like planning, like community, like preparation for what comes after the countdown. White America often celebrates possibility. Black America learned to measure probability. Neither is wrong, but pretending they are the same erases reality. The truth is uncomfortable. Some people enter the new year rested. Others enter it already tired. That difference wasn't accidental. It was produced by centuries where rest was denied, where joy was surveilled,
where time itself belonged to someone else. You don't undo that with a law. You don't erase that with a speech. You don't heal that with silence. Healing requires recognition. Recognition that inequality didn't end, it evolved. Recognition that exclusion wasn't incidental, it was designed. Recognition that some communities had to survive time, not enjoy it. This recognition doesn't demand guilt, it demands responsibility. Responsibility to tell fuller stories. Responsibility to question traditions we assume are harmless. Responsibility to notice who is missing from the narrative. The new year offers a test every time it arrives, not of optimism, but of honesty. Will we tell ourselves that progress solved everything, or will we admit that some debts are unpaid? Because the danger isn't remembering too much, it's remembering selectively. Selective memory creates myths, and myths protect comfort. But comfort has always been unequally distributed. The people who built this country didn't all get to enjoy it. The people who labored through its holidays didn't all get to rest. The people who endured its violence didn't all get to heal. And yet, they contributed anyway. They built culture anyway. They created meaning anyway. That resilience is often praised, but resilience is not a substitute for justice. Endurance should not be romanticized. It should be relieved. The new year can become more than a ritual. It can become an invitation to expand who gets to rest, who gets to feel safe, who gets to imagine without fear. That expansion doesn't happen automatically. It happens intentionally. It happens when we stop asking whether history is relevant and start asking who benefits from forgetting it. Because forgetting is convenient, remembering is demanding, but only one of them leads forward. Black Americans didn't wait for permission to move time forward. They carried it themselves, through restriction, through silence, through systems designed to exhaust them. That labor deserves acknowledgement, not applause, but change. Change that ensures rest is not earned by suffering. Change that ensures joy is not conditional. Change that ensures the future isn't just a promise, but a practice. The new year will come again, it always does. But renewal is not guaranteed by dates, it's guaranteed by decisions. Decisions to confront discomfort, decisions to tell the truth fully, decisions to recognize that time can be unequal and choose to correct it. This story doesn't end with resolution, because history didn't. It ends with a question. When the clock strikes midnight, who is truly allowed to begin again? And what are we willing to change so that answer finally includes everyone?
At the end of every story, there's an expectation, a resolution, a lesson neatly summarized, a sense that something has been settled. But real history doesn't resolve itself that way. It lingers.
The story of Black Americans in the new year is not a closed chapter. It's an ongoing condition, because time, as it turns out, doesn't treat everyone equally. Not naturally, not automatically. For some, the new year represents possibility without consequence. For others, it represents preparation. Preparation for instability. Preparation for disappointment. Preparation for systems that have not fully changed. This difference isn't imagined. It's inherited. Inherited from generations who learned, through experience, that dates don't guarantee dignity, that laws don't guarantee safety, that celebration doesn't guarantee inclusion. So they adapted. They learned to celebrate quietly, to hope carefully, to prepare even when others relaxed. That adaptation wasn't weakness, it was intelligence shaped by reality. But intelligence forged under pressure comes at a cost. The cost is exhaustion. Not the kind that sleep fixes, the kind that accumulates. Generational exhaustion doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up in caution, in restraint, in the instinct to double-check what others take for granted. This is why the idea of starting fresh often feels complicated,
because freshness assumes a clean slate, and some slates were never wiped clean. The new year invites people to imagine the future, but imagination requires safety. If your past taught you that joy can be interrupted, that rest can be revoked, that visibility can be dangerous, then imagination becomes disciplined, not absent, disciplined. That discipline has been misunderstood. It's been called pessimism. It's been called mistrust. It's been called negativity. But it's none of those things. It's memory doing its job. Memory exists to protect, to warn, to inform. For Black Americans, memory has never been optional. It was survival. And survival doesn't disappear when circumstances improve. It recalibrates. That recalibration is what many people see today without understanding its origin. They see caution without context, restraint without history, boundaries without explanation. This story exists to provide that context, not to assign blame, not to demand guilt, but to restore proportion. Because a society that only remembers its triumphs loses perspective, and a society that forgets who paid the cost of those triumphs loses integrity. The new year can be more than a performance of optimism. It can be a moment of accountability, a moment to ask, who has been allowed to rest? Who has not? Who still isn't? Those questions don't threaten unity. They define it. Unity without honesty is just silence wearing a smile. Black Americans didn't ask for special treatment. They asked for equal time, equal rest, equal safety, and for a long time they were denied all three. That denial shaped everything that followed: economics, health, education, trust. You don't correct that by pretending time alone fixed it. You correct it by understanding how deeply time was weaponized. This series doesn't argue that progress hasn't happened. It argues that progress doesn't erase origin. Understanding origin doesn't trap us in the past. It equips us for the future, because the future is built by people who remember, not by people who forget conveniently. The new year will continue to arrive. It always does. The question is whether it will arrive equally, whether rest will be normalized, whether joy will be safe, whether hope will be allowed to exist without discipline. Those outcomes are not guaranteed by tradition. They are guaranteed by intention. Intention to repair, intention to include, intention to listen to stories that complicate comfort. This story doesn't end with fireworks. It ends with responsibility. Responsibility to recognize uneven time, responsibility to tell fuller histories, responsibility to ensure that renewal isn't symbolic, but structural. If there is one truth to carry forward, it's this: time doesn't heal injustice. People do. And healing begins with remembering what others were forced to endure while the clock kept moving. So when the next new year arrives and the countdown begins, pause. Not to dampen celebration, but to deepen it. Because celebration grounded in truth is stronger than celebration built on forgetting. The new year wasn't always for everyone. Making it so is still unfinished work. And unfinished work doesn't diminish a nation. It challenges it to grow. This is not the end of the story. It's the responsibility it leaves behind. Long after the fireworks fade, long after the countdown ends, long after the calendars are replaced, something remains. Not excitement, not resolution. Awareness. Awareness that time has never been neutral, that dates don't carry justice on their own, that progress doesn't arrive equally. This awareness is not pessimism, it's maturity. Maturity is understanding that history doesn't disappear just because we stop talking about it. It settles into systems, into habits, into expectations. For Black Americans, this understanding has always been present, because the past never stayed behind them, it walked alongside them. Every generation inherited not just trauma, but instruction. Instruction on when to be cautious, when to celebrate quietly, when to prepare instead of relax. That instruction didn't come from theory, it came from experience. Experience that taught a simple truth: the calendar does not protect you. This is why certain phrases land differently. New beginnings, fresh start, clean slate. They sound hopeful, but they assume safety, and safety has never been guaranteed. So Black Americans learn to create meaning without guarantees. They learn to mark time internally, through resilience, through community, through continuity. They didn't wait for permission to feel human. They insisted on it. But insistence has a cost. The cost is vigilance, always watching, always measuring, always calculating what others assume. That vigilance didn't end with slavery. It didn't end with emancipation. It didn't end with civil rights legislation. It adapted, because systems adapt faster than they change. This is why the idea of closure feels misleading. There was no moment where everything resolved, no date where the ledger balanced. History didn't conclude, it transitioned. And transitions are messy, uneven, incomplete. The new year highlights this better than any other moment because it promises symmetry, everyone counting down together, everyone starting at zero. But zero has never meant the same thing. Some people begin the year with momentum, others begin it with recovery. Some begin with security, others begin with strategy. Those differences are not personal failures, they are historical outcomes. Understanding that doesn't weaken ambition, it sharpens it. Because ambition without context becomes cruelty. It blames individuals for conditions they didn't create. This is why remembering matters, not as nostalgia, not as grievance, but as calibration. Calibration keeps us honest. It prevents us from confusing survival with choice. It stops us from romanticizing endurance. Black Americans didn't endure because they wanted to. They endured because they had to. That endurance deserves relief, not celebration alone. The future cannot be built on admiration without repair. Repair begins with acknowledging uneven time, with recognizing that some communities were denied rest, joy, and safety for generations. That denial shaped outcomes we still see today. Health disparities, wealth gaps, educational inequities, trust deficits. None of these appeared randomly. They accumulated. And accumulation doesn't dissolve overnight. This is why patience is often demanded of those who have already waited longest, why urgency is dismissed is impatience, why restraint is mistaken for contentment. But restraint is not satisfaction, it's adaptation. The new year invites us to imagine better, but imagination without honesty repeats harm, so honesty must come first. Honesty about who carried the cost of progress. Honesty about who was excluded from celebration. Honesty about who still feels the weight of that exclusion. This honesty is not divisive, it's connective, because it allows us to see each other clearly, not as abstractions, but as people shaped by time differently. The most dangerous myth is that fairness arrives naturally. It doesn't. Fairness arrives through intention, through policy, through sustained attention. And attention begins with stories like this. Stories that complicate comfort, stories that resist simplification, stories that refuse to end neatly. The new year will come again. It always does. But the work remains. The work of ensuring rest is not earned through suffering. The work of ensuring joy is not conditional. The work of ensuring hope does not require discipline. That work doesn't belong to one group alone. It belongs to anyone who believes time should not be weaponized, anyone who believes renewal should be shared, anyone who believes history should inform, not imprison, the future. This story doesn't ask you to feel guilty. It asks you to stay aware. Awareness is the beginning of responsibility, and responsibility is the foundation of change. because time will continue to move forward, whether we correct its imbalance or not. The question is simple. Will we allow the future to repeat the past quietly, or will we insist on something better, intentionally? The new year isn't just a date, it's a mirror. What we see in it depends on what we're willing to remember.
There is a moment after every ending when silence arrives. Not empty silence, reflective silence. This is that moment. Because after all the stories, after the history, after the reminders, what remains is not information. It's responsibility. The responsibility to sit with what we now know. That time has never been neutral. That celebration has never been evenly distributed. That progress has never erased origin. For Black Americans, the new year was not always a promise. It was a reminder of work without rest, of joy without safety, of survival without recognition. Those reminders didn't fade when laws changed. They embedded themselves into behavior, into caution, into how people measure risk. This is not trauma speaking. It's memory doing its job. Memory exists to protect future generations, even when it makes the present uncomfortable. That discomfort is not a flaw. It's a signal that something unfinished remains. We often ask, why can't people just move on? But we rarely ask, move on to what? You can't move on from systems that still shape outcomes. You can't forget what still informs decisions. You can't celebrate fully when rest was historically denied. This series was never about removing joy. It was about restoring truth to it. Because joy without truth is fragile, and celebration without context is shallow. The new year can be more than fireworks and resolutions. It can be a moment of alignment. Alignment between past and present, between memory and action, between intention and repair. Repair doesn't mean punishment. It means correction. Correction of narratives that erased labor. Correction of traditions that ignored cost. Correction of assumptions that time heals everything. Time does not heal. People do. And people heal through honesty. Honesty about who paid the price of progress. Honesty about who carried time forward without rest. Honesty about who still feels that weight. That honesty doesn't divide, it clarifies. A society that understands its uneven history is better prepared to build an equitable future. The new year will keep arriving. That is inevitable. What is not inevitable is whether it arrives equally. Equality is not a feeling, it's a structure. It's built through policy, through access, through intentional redistribution of rest, safety, and opportunity. Black Americans were never asking for special treatment. They were asking for equal time. Equal time to rest, equal time to dream, equal time to live without vigilance. That request is not radical, it's human. And humanity is not something that should have to be proven. The future doesn't require forgetting the past, it requires understanding it fully. Because the past doesn't disappear when ignored, it repeats quietly. This series exists to interrupt that repetition, not by accusing, not by shaming, but by remembering. Remembering that celebration was once denied, that rest was once criminalized, that joy was once dangerous, and that those conditions shaped everything that followed. If there is one thing to carry forward, it's this. Awareness changes how we move through time. It changes how we celebrate, how we plan, how we listen. The new year doesn't promise renewal. People do. And renewal is not symbolic, it's structural. It shows up in who gets to rest without guilt, who gets to hope without discipline, who gets to imagine without fear. Those outcomes are choices we make collectively. The work is unfinished. That's not a failure. That's an invitation to expand the meaning of celebration, to include those who were excluded, to repair what was denied. The new year wasn't always for everyone. Making it so is still our responsibility. Not tomorrow, not eventually, now. Because time will continue to move forward. The question is, will justice move with it? There is a moment after every ending when the noise finally fades, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of understanding. This is that moment, because after all the dates, the names, the stories, and the images, what remains is not information. What remains is responsibility. Responsibility to acknowledge that time has never been neutral, that celebration has never been evenly distributed, that progress has never erased its cost. For Black Americans, the new year was not always a beginning. Often, it was a reminder that work did not pause, that rest was conditional, that joy was watched, limited, or denied. While others counted down to midnight, Black families counted consequences. While fireworks filled the sky, fear lingered in the streets. While calendars turned, conditions stayed the same. This was not accidental. It was designed. Time itself became a tool of control. Who could rest? Who could gather? Who could celebrate without punishment? And when laws changed, the memory did not disappear. It adapted. It moved into behavior, into caution, into inherited awareness. This is not trauma exaggerating the past. This is memory doing its job. Memory exists to protect what history refused to. That protection often looks like restraint, like hesitation, like a quiet distance from celebration. People ask why some communities do not fully embrace symbolic moments, why joy feels measured, why optimism comes with conditions. But the better question is not why people hesitate, it is why the system expects forgetting. You cannot move on from structures that still shape outcomes. You cannot celebrate freely inside systems that were never repaired. You cannot demand closure when accountability never arrived. The new year promises renewal, but renewal requires more than time passing. It requires correction. Correction of narratives that denied labor, correction of traditions that ignored suffering, correction of assumptions that time alone heals injustice. Time does not heal, people do, and people heal through honesty. Honesty about who paid for prosperity, honesty about who carried society forward without rest, honesty about who still feels that weight today. That honesty is not divisive, it is clarifying. A society that understands its uneven history is better equipped to build an equitable future. The new year will continue to arrive. That is inevitable. What is not inevitable is whether it arrives equally. Equality is not symbolic, it is structural. It appears in access to safety, in access to rest, in access to dignity without negotiation. Black Americans were never asking for special treatment, they were asking for equal time. Equal time to rest without guilt, equal time to dream without punishment, equal time to live without constant calculation. That request was never radical, it was human, and humanity should not have to be proven. This series was never meant to remove joy from celebration. It was meant to restore truth to it, because joy without truth is fragile, and celebration without context is hollow. The new year can be more than fireworks and resolutions. It can be a moment of alignment between memory and action, between acknowledgement and repair, between intention and responsibility. Repair does not mean punishment, it means correction. Correction of systems that denied rest, correction of narratives that minimized harm, correction of futures built on selective memory. The past does not disappear when ignored, it repeats quietly. That repetition shows up in disparities, in mistrust, in exhaustion passed down through generations. Remembering is not about guilt, it is about clarity. Clarity allows societies to move forward without dragging unresolved harm behind them. The new year will continue to arrive, that is inevitable. People bring renewal,
And renewal is not poetic, it is practical. It shows up in policy, in protection, in who is allowed to exist without fear. Those outcomes are choices. Choices made collectively, choices repeated over time, choices that shape what the future becomes. The work is unfinished. That is not a failure. It is an invitation. An invitation to expand who celebration includes, to repair what was denied, to acknowledge what was carried silently. The new year was not always for everyone. Making it so remains our responsibility. Not tomorrow, not eventually, now. Because time will continue moving forward. The only question is whether justice will move with it.
The future is often spoken about as if it arrives untouched, as if it appears clean, separate from everything that came before. But the future is not new, it is inherited. Every generation receives time already shaped by laws written earlier, by silences chosen earlier, by harms never repaired. What we call now is simply the past continuing. That is why memory matters. Not as nostalgia, not as punishment, but as orientation. Without memory, societies lose direction. They mistake motion for progress. They confuse speed with justice. The new year has always symbolized forward movement, a turning of pages, a fresh start. But fresh starts require honest endings. You cannot close a chapter you never read. You cannot move forward while pretending nothing was left behind. For Black Americans, the past has never stayed behind. It traveled forward quietly, into housing, into education, into labor, into health. It shaped which communities absorb risk, which communities absorb exhaustion, which communities are expected to endure silently. That endurance has often been misinterpreted as strength, but endurance is not a virtue when it is forced. Survival should not be the highest expectation placed on any people. The future should offer more than survival. It should offer choice. Choice to rest without justification, choice to celebrate without calculation, choice to imagine without restraint. Those choices are still unevenly distributed. This is not because history was cruel. It is because history was never corrected. Correction is uncomfortable. It requires admission. It requires repair. But repair is not about blame. It is about balance. Balance between what was taken and what was built, between what was denied and what was promised. The future does not ask us to carry guilt. It asks us to carry responsibility. Responsibility to design systems that do not reproduce harm. Responsibility to recognize that neutrality often protects inequality. Responsibility to act intentionally rather than symbolically. Symbols matter, but structures decide outcomes. A holiday does not equal rest if wages are unstable. A resolution does not equal opportunity if access is unequal. A promise does not equal justice if enforcement is absent. The future demands more precision than slogans. It demands listening to patterns rather than dismissing them. It demands seeing disparities as signals, not coincidences. It demands humility about what progress truly requires. Progress is not measured by comfort, it is measured by fairness. Fairness in how time is experienced. Fairness in how risk is distributed. Fairness in who benefits from collective growth. The new year will always return. That rhythm will not change. What can change is meaning. Meaning is not fixed, it is assigned. And meaning becomes powerful when it includes everyone. The future does not need perfection, it needs commitment. Commitment to remember without becoming frozen, commitment to repair without becoming defensive, commitment to move forward without erasing who was left behind. That commitment is ongoing. It does not arrive with fireworks. It shows up quietly, repeatedly, in policies written carefully, in protections enforced consistently,
in choices made even when no one is watching. The future is shaped by accumulation, small decisions repeated over time. So is injustice, so is repair. The question is not whether the future will be different, it always is. The question is whether it will be fairer. Fairness requires courage, not dramatic courage, sustained courage, the kind that resists convenience, the kind that questions tradition, the kind that refuses to confuse familiarity with morality. History shows us what happens when comfort is prioritized over justice. The future asks us to choose differently, not once, continually. The new year does not reset responsibility, it renews it. Each arrival is another opportunity to decide what kind of society we are willing to maintain. Maintenance is the work most people ignore, but it is where futures are protected. A just future is not built by declarations, it is maintained through vigilance. Vigilance against forgetting, vigilance against minimizing harm, vigilance against narratives that excuse inequality as natural. Inequality is never natural, it is constructed, and what is constructed can be corrected. The future is watching how we remember, because memory shapes design. If we remember selectively, we build selectively. If we remember honestly, we build inclusively. The new year is not a clean slate, it is a continuation. What we choose to continue determines everything. The future will not judge intentions, it will inherit outcomes. Those outcomes are being shaped now, not by grand gestures, by daily decisions, by what is normalized, by what is challenged, by what is allowed to persist quietly. Time does not absolve, it records. And one day the future will look back at us, not asking what we said, but asking what we sustained.
Every ending eventually becomes a beginning, whether we acknowledge it or not. History does not close chapters cleanly, it folds them forward. What we inherit is never neutral, never untouched, never free of intention. The future carries fingerprints. Some are gentle, some are violent, some are simply ignored. What matters is not pretending those marks do not exist, but deciding what we do with them. Part 14 is not a conclusion, it is a pause before responsibility resumes. Because responsibility never ends, it only changes hands, quietly, across generations, through choices that feel small but accumulate into systems everywhere, always. The new year has been framed as renewal, but renewal without reckoning is performance. Celebration can distract as easily as it can inspire. When societies rush forward without looking down, they trip over the same fractures repeatedly. For Black Americans, the future has often arrived with familiar obstacles, disguised as progress. Barriers change language, not function. Inequality adapts. Memory, therefore, becomes a tool, not a burden. Remembering is not about remaining angry, it is about remaining accurate. Accuracy protects futures. Inaccuracy repeats harm. If we want a different outcome, we must begin with truth, even when truth interrupts comfort itself. Time alone has never repaired injustice. Waiting has never produced fairness. What changes conditions is intervention, sustained and intentional. The future depends on what is corrected, not what is hoped. Repair is not symbolic, it requires redistribution of safety, access, and rest. It requires dismantling systems that reward endurance while denying relief. Black communities were forced to master survival, but survival was never the goal. Living fully was. The difference matters. A future built only on resilience is still exploitative. A future built on equity allows people to exist without armor, without vigilance, without inherited fear and trauma cycles. The idea that history should stay in the past is convenient for those who benefited most. For those who paid the cost, history lives daily. It shapes caution, expectation, and trust. It influences how joy is expressed and how risk is calculated. These are not personal flaws,
They are rational adaptations. The future must account for that reality. Ignoring it does not create unity, it creates misunderstanding. Unity grows from recognition. Recognition grows from listening. Listening requires patience. Patience requires humility. Without humility, progress becomes performance again, and cycles repeat under new names, leaving the structure intact and harm unresolved. Education alone will not save the future, but ignorance guarantees its failure. Knowing history is not enough. Applying it matters. Application looks like policy, protection, and prevention. It looks like reducing harm before it multiplies. It looks like ensuring celebration does not coexist with suffering. The new year should not mask inequality. It should measure progress honestly. Measurement requires data, transparency, and accountability. Accountability requires courage. Courage is not loud, it is consistent. It persists when attention fades. The future will not reward good intentions. It will reflect the systems we maintain, challenge, or leave untouched over time, continually evolving. One day, the future will examine this moment. It will ask what we normalized and what we challenged. It will not care how advanced we believed ourselves to be. It will care who benefited and who bore the cost. The question will not be whether we celebrated loudly, but whether we corrected quietly, whether we repaired structures instead of reputations, whether we chose equity over ease. Those decisions are being made now, not later, not abstractly, in budgets, classrooms, neighborhoods, and workplaces. The future is watching patterns, not promises. Patterns reveal truth faster than speeches ever could. Alone, today, always. The most important lesson is simple, but difficult to accept. No decision fixes everything. Every choice redistributes weight. Progress creates new responsibilities. Justice demands maintenance. There is no final victory, only ongoing correction. That reality does not diminish hope, it grounds it. Grounded hope survives disappointment. It adapts rather than collapses. The future belongs to those willing to adjust without erasing, to remember without freezing, to act without waiting for permission. Permission rarely arrives. History shows that repair begins when people decide comfort is no longer more valuable than fairness, and convenience is no longer mistaken for peace or justice. The new year is not an ending, it is a checkpoint, a moment to evaluate direction, not just speed. The future does not need perfection from us, it needs honesty, effort, and continuity. Continuity is where most change fails, because it is unglamorous, but continuity builds trust. Trust allows healing. Healing allows imagination. Imagination allows redesign. Redesign allows equity. This chain cannot be rushed, it must be protected. The work continues beyond this series, beyond this moment, beyond any calendar date. The future will not arrive ready-made. It will be assembled by what we choose to sustain, correct, and refuse. Refusal is often misunderstood. It is not negativity, it is discernment. It is the decision to stop carrying what was never yours to hold. Black history shows refusal again and again, not as rebellion for its own sake, but as preservation. Preservation of dignity, preservation of life, preservation of possibility. The future benefits when refusal is respected rather than punished, when boundaries are honored rather than challenged. Societies grow healthier when they stop demanding endless sacrifice from the same people. Sustainability applies to humans too. A future that burns out its builders will eventually collapse, no matter the design appears. This is where Part 14 rests, not with certainty, but with clarity. Clarity that the future is shaped by attention, by what we notice and what we normalize. The new year does not absolve us, it invites us to carry memory without bitterness, to pursue justice without spectacle, to build systems that do not require suffering to function. That invitation remains open. The future is not waiting for perfection, it is waiting for participation. participation grounded in truth, participation sustained over time, participation willing to repair, not rush. What comes next depends on who accepts that invitation fully, collectively, responsibly.
They told you the new year is about fresh starts. But fresh for who? Because for some people, history never reset. It just changed uniforms. Black Americans didn't just survive the past, they carried it forward so the future could exist at all. Every celebration you enjoy stands on time someone else was denied. This isn't about guilt, it's about awareness, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you know the truth, the question isn't what happened. The question is, what happens next? If time remembers everything, what will it remember about us?